great privilege to be able to introduce this event around a wonderful work of scholarship, a magnificent social and economic history of the Nattukottai Chettiars by Raman Mahadevan. I'd like to situate this book in the context of the history of intellectual life in post-independence. Raman is a product of arguably the most maligned public institution in India today, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Now, I must confess that long before the present regime ever came to power, I contributed in a modest way to this maligning when I was myself a college student, because I was a student in Delhi University, the other side of the road, and I refused to shift my allegiance to the JNU. And I always held it against the JNU, that my university, the University of Delhi, which is much older than JNU, much larger, arguably with a more storied history. After JNU became famous, from the University of Delhi, my university simply became DU as against JNU. So till the age of 22, I had a, shall we say, an unreasoning prejudice against the JNU, not on intellectual grounds, but mainly on grounds of institutional loyalty. Until I went to do a PhD in IIM Calcutta, where I had the extraordinarily good fortune of being mentored by a remarkable scholar, the late Anjan Ghosh, who was a product of JNU. And in some ways, I consider myself also, shall we say, an Eklavya child of the JNU School of History Writing. Because without Anjan, I would have never become a scholar. And the marks of, JNU before 2014, or JNU as it really was and not how as it has been misrepresented, the marks of the scholarship, the best marks of the scholarship. Of course, like any public institution, the JNU had its share of ideologues and hacks and opportunists and careerists. That goes with the territory, but it also had some extraordinarily wise and sagacious scholars. And it's in that environment that Raman's superb work of scholarship, first took shape. His doctoral supervisor, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, was a very fine, wide-ranging historian of social and economic life. He wrote on banking, on commerce, on trade, on intellectual history, on Bengali culture. And he was also a very caring supervisor. And if you look at Raman's book, it is I would say, exemplary, of course, in the depth of its scholarship, in the subtlety of its analysis, in the clarity of its prose. So all these three things mark it out: the depth of its scholarship, the subtlety of its analysis, and the clarity of its prose. But from the point of view of the writing of Indian history, modern Indian history, it's also a gender-bending or boundary-crossing work in three respects. One is it brings together sociology and economics, or caste and class. Now, the Marxists who dominated one part of JNU, and Sabyasachi was influenced by Marxism, but not a Marxist. He was for them, caste was an epiphenomenon. And of course, it certainly is not. But if you look at the last 30 years and kind of very energetic politics around caste, you have the reverse now. It's status dealing from livelihood and economics. Once upon a time, economics was dealing from status and dignity, and now it's the reverse. So it brings together caste and class, sociology and economics in a very interesting and productive way. The second way in which it is, shall we say, gender bending, is that it starts before 1947 and carries on till well beyond 47. Now, traditionally, Indian history was divided into three phases: ancient, medieval, and modern. And the kind of beginnings of and the endings of the first two phases were slightly amorphous and fuzzy. But the ending of the third phase was very, very clear. When the clock struck midnight on 15th August 1947, history ended and political science began. Now, this may have made sense in the 50s and 60s, but now we have 70 years to look back on our history. And Raman's book begins the story, of course, in the 19th century and brings it right up to the 1960s. The third way in which it is gender bending is that it is a study of India in the world. Now, many Indian historians are bound by territorial considerations. Their books are only about India, or only about Gujarat, or only about Ahmedabad, and so on. This looks at but the Nattukottai Chettiars, of course, were engaged in business, trade, commerce, politics, cultural life across the boundaries. And that is it's a story of India and the world, and notably, India of the world to the east of it, which again is rather unusual because Indian history, Indian intellectual life, Indian political life, Indian economic life, when it is interested in the world outside India, it's usually the West. And of course, now all the talk is about what will happen in the trade deal. But this looks, Raman's book actually looks by the story, his story, and its focus, brings our physical territory that the Indian subcontinent inhabits into engagement through its maritime, cultural, economic engagement with the world to the east of it. So in all these respects, it's, as I said, a boundary crossing and gender bending work. And it was a great privilege to be able to read it in proof form. And I commend it to everyone. Please go and buy a copy after this event ends. And I now really look forward to the conversation between Raman and Hari and Carol. Thank you.
Good evening, my fellow book lovers, for coming over to this event. At the outset, my very special thanks to BIC and to Mr. Vikram Bhatt and his entire team, and especially Sandhya and Sunayana for hosting this event and also organizing it with so much care. I'm especially beholden to Ram Guha, who agreed to read the final manuscript despite his busy schedule and then endorse it so fulsomely. It's also been very nice of him to willingly and enthusiastically agree to introduce the book for the first public event around it. A word of special thanks to Professor Carol Upadhya and K.N. Harikumar, both of whom agreed without any hesitation to be here for this discussion on the book. Neither of them needs any introduction. Both of them are very reputed and distinguished professionals in their respective fields, namely academics and journalism. I have no doubt that they will enliven the proceedings with their incisive comments and observations. I'm presuming that many in this room would have either read the book or some of the excerpts that appeared in the popular news magazines, such as Scroll, Outlook, Mint, Print, and News Minute, besides a detailed review recently in the Deccan Herald. Though Indian business communities across India were legendary and exercised major influence in the credit and commodity markets from medieval times, the Chettiar story, as revealed in my book and by many predecessors in academia, is unusually fascinating, with few parallels. It's exceptional when compared to the record of other business communities for the manner in which the community soared to great heights, but then eventually went off the radar. Given the time constraint, I shall briefly dwell upon two major themes of the book. The first traces my own journey and the making of the book, and the second relates to what I think are some of the core arguments of the book. I shall end by reading a small passage from the book. My journey of researching this community was marked by two phases. The first phase in the early 1970s, when I just embarked on my research, which was one of exploring the unexplored. The then prevailing literature on Indian business was heavily weighted in favor of the western, eastern, and northern regions of India, and the south was perceived as largely agricultural and too remote to deserve any serious attention. This was the trigger for me to examine the nature of commercial enterprise and, in my own small way, redress this misconception. And in this context, I must thank Dharma Kumar, the late Professor Dharma Kumar at the Delhi School of Economics, for prodding me to work on the Chettiars. The choice inevitably fell on the Chettiars, as they were unquestionably the largest and the dominant fraction of South Indian capital. The lack of adequate data and information on them in the government archives, both in Delhi and in Chennai, in a sense pushed me into the Chettinad region. This was a game changer for me. It opened the world of the extremely rich non-archival sources, mostly in the vernacular or the Tamil language. Of course, being an immigrant Tamilian who grew up in Delhi, I had the misfortune of not knowing Tamil, so I had to seek the help of my friends who knew Tamil and my family members to help me translate this extremely rich material. I could use some of this material to give shape to my dissertation on the Chettiars. Its period of study was the pre-1930, the quiescent phase marked by the Chettiars' emergence as major economic players in the commercialization process in many parts of Southeast Asia. Between the late 70s and 1990s, my research interests moved to the larger question of understanding of the making of regional capitalists in the nodal Tamil region of southern India. However, all along and beyond that phase, there was a lurking disquiet within me about the manner in which the history of the Chettiars had been depicted. I therefore chose to revisit them, focusing on the neglected post-1930 period that was one of intense turbulence and churn, economically, socially, and politically. It was around this time that Mr. Gurcharan Das, through Penguin, approached me for a popular, jargon-free, non-academic history of the South Indian business community. And it was quite an exercise because I had to really shed my academic robe, and writing in a popular vein required a lot of effort. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said. What you see here is the result of this exercise. I can't claim to have said the last word on the Chettiars. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said and written. I hope my work instigates other young scholars to initiate more probing into the Chettiars' fascinating past. As for the core issues which this book seeks to raise and address here are: one, the organized overseas migration to take advantage of investment opportunities by the Chettiars was quite exceptional. Migration per se by business communities was not uncommon at all, as the case of Marwadis, the Gujarati Baniyas, the Parsis, the Sindhis, and the Boras would suggest. However, what was unique to the Chettiars was the organizational structure of an intricate intra-caste banking network that was put in place to effectively utilize opportunities to their advantage. And the second issue is the period from 1930 to 1950 was one of fast-paced socio-economic and political transformation and upheaval, which majorly destabilized the traditional banking structure and modes of operation. It compelled the Chettiars, both as a community as well as individual members, to come to terms with the emerging situation and harsh reality, and to adjust, accommodate, and diversify. This critical aspect, which is really the, shall I say, the spine of this book, has not received the attention it deserves by other scholars. In fact, I have said somewhere else that, in fact, the Chettiars were a milch cow for the academic industry, if I can put it that way, because well over a dozen dissertations have been submitted in India and outside India on the Chettiars, based mainly on two major reports: the Madras Provincial Banking Inquiry Committee report and the Burma Provincial Banking Inquiry Committee report. These two reports, which were based on surveys and interviews with bankers conducted in 1928 and 29, it was published in 1929, has been the major source of many studies which have appeared on the Chettiars. So the point of departure of my work is that not that I have disregarded the pre-19. For me, the post-1930 period was much more fascinating, much more challenging. So I took it upon myself to revisit the Chettiars from the time I started my work in 70s to 1990s and 2000 and 2010. I revisited them, went back to my sources, which I was sitting on, looked at them critically, and the outcome of that is this book. Uh, uh, yeah. Um, what I say is, furthermore, diversification didn't necessarily imply investment in industry, as was the case among business communities elsewhere in India. In fact, that's one of the questions which I have raised. It's not that the Chettiars do not diversify post 1930, because 1930 was really 1930s and the Second World War were, in fact, major turning points in the history of this community, in as much as the economic churn that the 30s and the 40s threw up, created a situation where the Chettiars had to make major changes, in the way they functioned, and the whole traditional intra-caste banking system folds up, and what you have in place is the modern joint stock companies. So Chettiar firms are now refashioned as modern companies, private limited companies, and much of this investment is in the financial sphere, not in manufacturing. And this is because, and this is unlike the other business communities, whether it's the Parsis, whether it's the Marwadis, or whether it's the Gujaratis, right from the turn of the century, but much more so after the First World War, invest majorly in industry. The Chettiars failed to do that. I mean, there are a few exceptions. Uh, the Chettiars those who didn't move into banking, who were more into trade, we find them, like Karamuthu Tyagarai Chettiar, move in a big way into industry. But other than that, much of them do not really move into industry. So I think I'll stop with that and read a small passage which, in a sense, uh, sums up what this book is all about. Uh, this book is the story of the community's entrepreneurship, not only in South India, but on shores far beyond. It's about the spirit of enterprise that led many community members to seek their fortunes overseas, with all the attendant twists and turns that spelled success or failure or penury for them. It's about the transformation and diversification of the community and the breakdown of the old business and social networks over time. It is the story of how risk and courage, as much as trust, was central to the whole epic of wealth generation in southern India. In a sense, their story is also a thread that connects South India, Burma, and Southeast Asia across the Bay of Bengal. It's equally one that spans the era from British imperial rule to the modern nation states. The Chettiar story offers a glimpse into a kaleidoscope of changes, some of which were epochal. I think I'll stop with that, and I'll call upon Carol and Hari to offer their comments.
So I would very much like to thank Professor Mahadevan for inviting me to discuss the book and giving me an opportunity to read it. And also thanks to BIC for arranging the event. I read the book as a sociologist, anthropologist, which is what I am. I'm not much of a historian, but it's a topic in which I've been interested for a long time because I've also done some studies of so-called traditional business communities. And as you would all know, the Chettiars are a prime example of a very enterprising and also long-standing business community in South India, which was very crucial to much of the Indian economy over quite a few centuries. I just made some notes here, and I thought I would just pick up a few points for maybe we could come back to in discussion. Again, because I'm not a historian, I might have missed some of the finer, nuances of the argument. But one thing that stood out for me a lot was the way in which the story of the Chettiars illustrates how indigenous Indian mercantile communities really followed the lines of British expansion and empire and found niches or roles where their services were required for banking, for organizing trade, etc. And this is very much true as the story of the Chettiars unfolds in this book. So whether it's a plantation sector in Ceylon or in Malaya, or handling the trade in primary commodities in various parts of Southeast Asia and then going into Burma, it's a really fascinating history of how this community has really kind of both paved the way, I would say, possibly for certain activities of the British colonial power, but also followed the pathways that were opened up by colonialism in finding ways in which to invest and multiply their own wealth. And one of the things about the Chettiars, and in fact all of the so-called traditional business communities in India, which have been written about by anthropologists, is a focus on the ways in which the community organization or the caste organization was very central to the way in which they organized their economic life, their economic activities. One, caste, and second, family, or the so-called joint family, or the kinship structure. These were the basic social structures around which enterprise was organized. And one of the interesting things about the book is what we get is a story of how those kinds of structures shift over time. And because the story of Chettiars is embedded, is unfolded historically and embedded in the particular historical context of a particular period, especially coming from the 1930s to the 1940s, we get a very kind of clear sense of how they both utilize this so-called traditional kind of community organization in pursuing different types of investment, different types of economic ventures, but also how they get altered, how they get kind of transformed as they met particular challenges. So for example, the challenge of the Depression and the economic, kind of consequences of that, and later the 1930s, what was happening in Southeast Asia, what's happening in Burma, how they respond, and everywhere where they're going, they are kind of adapting and using their so-called, their business acumen, but particularly using the ways in which they are organized socially to insert themselves into new kinds of economic activities. So one of the things about that, and we also get a very clear sense from the story, especially from the 1930s and 1940s, about how when they are beginning to face challenges because of the economic climate, because of the growth of the nationalist movement, because of things that are happening in Burma and other places where they have established themselves, how they, as Professor Mahadevan just said, how they begin to try to kind of refigure the way in which they do business and start trying to develop more so-called modern institutions. So the joint stock company, the so-called modern banking sector. And we get a really clear sense of the debates and the tensions within the community, which were very visible, and it was not an unconscious process. It's a process in which they are beginning to think about how they can best adapt themselves to the changing economic and political climate that they're facing. And so we begin to see them, kind of moving between so-called traditional modes of organization and the modern way of organizing business. And there's a kind of suggestion or in the book that tension itself and that kind of uncertainty or conflict around how do we now reorganize ourselves or reassert ourselves given all the challenges, that itself is one of the reasons why we see a decline of Chettiar power post-independence especially. And I'm wondering whether that is something which, we can think about further, that because, and you do make this point towards the end that, and you just now made the point about investment in industry. This is one of the key themes we see in a lot of the literature on Indian business, history of Indian business, economic history and business communities, is this question of who started to turn away from trade and money lending and finance in these traditional sectors and started to invest in industry. Where did Indian indigenous industrialization come from? So we see it with Marwaris, we see it in Western India, of course, Bombay and Ahmedabad, and much less so in South India, and much less so with Chettiars. So then the question becomes why? What were the constraints, right? Or what were maybe not constraints, but lack of incentive or motivation? And I think there's a lot more one could think about in this thing. I mean, maybe it's just simply a matter of context, time and place. But you do mention that when Chettiar capital starts to come back into India because of problems where it was invested outside, and it's coming into Tamil Nadu, it's coming into Chennai, but it's not going much into industry, but it's going into all these other sectors like film production, insurance, other kinds of, finance business, stock brokerage, etc. And we see exactly the same kind of trend in other parts of South India with other communities around the same time. So then my question is, what was it about this particular time and place that somehow militated against industrial investment, except for, of course, the kinds of, the examples that you give of the textile mills and sugar mills, etc. But it was nothing like what we see in Western India or even in Bengal. But at the same time, one thing that came to my mind while I was reading the book is that why do we always ask this question? Why is it always a matter of industrialization? Did it happen? Did it not happen? How did it happen? And I was thinking that, one thing, of course, is part of modernization theory. We always imagine that the path to economic development is via industrialization because that's what happened in Britain, etc. But there's another part of it where if you look at even the Marxist framework, there's a notion that investment in other sectors like finance and trade is the so-called secondary circuit of capital, which is the unproductive circuit, right, as opposed to the productive circuit, which is industry and manufacturing. And then I was thinking that, obviously these are also activities, economic activities, without which industry cannot flourish. You need also trade, you also need finance, etc. So why is it that these are kind of denigrated activities? And then I was thinking about the fact that traditional business, I don't like this term, but business mercantile communities in India have traditionally always been kind of marked or kind of denigrated because they engage in money lending, because they're the ones who run the finance, they're the ones who engage in these type of activities, as opposed to industry, which is kind of put at a different plane, right? So I was just, this is just some random thoughts about the fact that, there's a kind of received image of mercantile communities, whether it's Marwaris or whether it's, Banyas or various groups, as, these are the ones who are kind of the predators, they're exploitative, et cetera. And there's a whole discourse around this, which actually originates with British. And it's there in all these reports that you mentioned, right? And I was just thinking that, there has to be a way to get out from this kind of rigid framework where we're all the time kind of saying that because they didn't do this or that, then, they did not somehow contribute to economic development. Yeah, so that's just, basically the book itself, I think, for me, it really goes a long way in kind of taking the kind of concerns that anthropologists and all have looked at when they look at things like caste and class and business communities. And really, by historicizing, it makes me kind of be much more aware of the fact that we cannot think about any of these structures, whether it's caste or the so-called joint family, as something which is either timeless or which, it either continues or it doesn't. We see how it reshapes itself, how it's malleable, how it becomes, responds to the economic circumstances that they're confronted with. So I think I'm running out of time, so I should probably stop here. I had a couple questions that if there's time for discussion later, maybe we could come back and talk about. One was the one I already mentioned about investment, not in manufacturing, but other sectors. But the second was about, you also mentioned this. I'm just curious to know more about the Chettiar attitude towards risk. Because for all these communities or any kind of business community, there is a whole question of to what extent are you willing to confront risk, how do you manage risk, and there's also this tendency in the literature to talk about diversification as a risk management strategy. So I'm just curious about how they would compare with, say, Marwadis or other groups like that in terms of their propensity to, or their tolerance for risk. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I did wonder why I was called here because I'm a journalist, not a historian. So I did have a little bit one or two doubts, but Raman did convince me somehow. I don't know whether that's a correct decision or not. But I have thought about this. I read his book, which is very fascinating, and I liked it very much. And we go back a long way. But one thing that did strike me in the book, the Chettiars. I mean, if you look at my own perspective, when I thought of Chettiars, I thought of them as somebody very big industrialist. I'm from Bangalore. I'm from the Mysore state, the old Mysore state. So when we look at Madras state or the pre-British Madras state and the Tamil Nadu, which is kind of a successor state of that. And the Chettiars there, we see them as very big industrialists. Of course, may not, maybe I had thought that Marwadis were bigger. This was even in my school days. But one question that I thought of in those days was, why is it that the local businessmen, the Chettis, they are the most important businessmen that I knew in Bangalore in those days, in the 50s, the 60s and 70s, committees, essentially Telugu-speaking committees. They were not anything like the Chettiars. and why was that? I mean, what makes them different? And it struck me. And of course, at that time, Bangalore was a very small place and Madras was a huge place, and Delhi and Bombay were also very big places. But Madras was the third largest city of India. And maybe Delhi developed to that. But Calcutta, the three presidency cities, and therefore, and the Chettiars being oriented towards one of those cities. And they had a broader perspective. I mean, I didn't know much about their international thing, but I did know a little bit. But in this context, especially when I compared them, but my standard of comparison was with the committees and other businessmen. In Vishweshpuram, you get all the committee businessmen. They were all in trade, and they were all in small shopkeepers or traders, the rice trade or various petes. And also there were some who became a little bit into industry, and they were prominent people here. The road on which I stayed is Subram Shetty Road, and we had a person, his brother, and they were in a small industry. I mean, very, very small industry. And they were manufacturing furniture, things like that, like Godrej, but that kind of thing. So why didn't they have this broader view? And also even in fact there was a theory which came up later under Professor Savashaji Bhattacharya had a theory that those business communities which migrated from their home bases, they became big, they became large, and they became successful, and that is because they had they were rid of, or at least the traditional commitments they had in their old localities or the old regions. That was cut off. They didn't have those obligations anymore. And the examples he gave was that the Marwadis came from small district, a small group of villages in Rajasthan, and they went and made their money in Calcutta. And the Chettiars, who came from one small 87 villages in lower southern Tamil Nadu and became huge in Tamil Nadu itself, but also in and Burma primarily, but also from what I saw in the book, Southeast Asia, going all the way to Vietnam, Indochina. So this theory, I thought, let me see if there's anything, but I didn't get a answer from the book. I didn't see an examination of the theory, especially since Professor Bhattacharya was his initial research guide for his MPhil. So, but I think it did have an implication why other business communities of uh, South India, or even in maybe in Tamil Nadu. After all, Chettiars are not the only business community. He has given other business communities names. And they were also, the whole of Tamil Nadu is a big state, and so is Rajasthan. And so that was one issue that concerned me from one point of view, even as a high school boy or college, as a youth. The second issue is, why is it that all the business communities emerged from the British India? That's because I come from non-British India, and I come from the non-ports. That is the main ports, the one presidencies: Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta. And that was one of the things, again, from maybe a princely state point of view, you can call it. I just thought about that. I have a princely state point of view, and I have a different point of view. So that I thought maybe the British India had, they were the centers of trade. They were most important, and all the trade was between Europe and India, and also maybe Southeast Asia and maybe Middle East Africa. But the most important was Europe and India, England and India, and to some extent Europe, and England and the colonies. Like what we see here, the British colonies of Southeast Asia was where the Chettiars were also, most of them were importantly there. The non-British colonies, they were not so important. Of course, Indochina is an exception, but that's very far away and that's not where they were. But the British colonies. And in any case, Burma was part of India. It was part of, actually, it was a province of India. It was not it was only in 1935, the Government of India Act and the Government of Burma Act, that it got separated. So it was not, it was like going from one province to another, though partly you had to undertake it by sea as far as, but from North India, if you went to Bengal to Burma, it was not by sea, it was just a neighboring province. So this issue of whether the other opportunity, why the communities in British India, which had the trading opportunities, and there were centers of trade, and they had more modern education was there, and also the links with the contacts with the government officials, etc. So I thought that, this is what, again, not a rigorous historian, but that these centers of, this is my edition, not other people's edition, that they came. Now, these communities are still, even till today, the most important communities. And also in Western India, you have the Parsis and Gujaratis coming to Bombay. Again, they are migratory. They came from another place to, maybe not be so far away, but still they came to Bombay, and that's when they succeeded. So, but in those days, probably Bombay was not so important, because it wasn't, it was actually Calcutta first and Chennai. That's where the British, in terms of their conquest also, in terms of this thing. So these reasons, I thought the Chettiars probably, again, I'm looking at it from this perspective. That is why I was a bit surprised by one thing, that is the Chettiars went off the radar, he said just now, and that totally surprised me. They've never been off my radar, I can tell you that much. The second thing is, and I didn't know that, of course, they had these setbacks. I knew, of course, that they were thrown out of Burma after the independence, but I didn't know their all the details about their coming back from other places, and the impact of independence and nationalist movements and other things which has been highlighted in the book. And I didn't know there are other things in relation to Malaya and Malaysia and all that kind of thing. So what is the, so this is another aspect. But I was certainly, one thing that did surprise me, yes, they did have setbacks and they did go back, but they are still a very large community. In my younger days, I used to hear about M.M. Ramsamy and Southern Indian Petrochemicals Corporation, SPIC, and M.A. Chidambaram. Of course, some of these people were also in public life, but that's maybe businessmen also there. But, or in like sports and horse racing and things like that, which is also brought out in the book. This is, I saw them even in their fallen days, they are much bigger than anybody in Karnataka. In Mysore, for example, that there's no comparison. There's no comparison between a trader here, and that goes up to even to today. So why is that? That was the question. And so why did they become successful and why did this? So I had two explanations and looking at it from different perspective. No, but I think maybe there's another perspective you're thinking about, and that's probably, you can call that a Madras presidency perspective or a Tamil Nadu perspective. Why are the Chettiars not as big as the Marwadis and the Gujaratis? Now, that's a different perspective. I didn't have that because I was not from that area. So from that area, you can say they have fallen back. So it's a matter of, the half glass, half full, half empty. That's one kind of thing. So the reasons for that, I think partly, I'm not so sure it's got to do with lack of enterprise. Of course, the setbacks are real. I mean, the Barbadis did not invest in a province or invest in an area like Calcutta, which went out of the Indian nation. That was one problem. And that is an advantage they had. And therefore, they faced some difficulties. But neither did the Gujarati. Of course, the Gujarati went to East Africa, where they got thrown out. I mean, that was a problem of Idi Amin threw them out, and they had a lot of problems, similar problems. And they came even to Bangalore. Some of them came to Bangalore, etc. In the 1960s and 70s. I know East African Gujaratis who have met people, but I met them, in fact, immediately in London. They were totally impoverished. They had nothing. They came out of nothing. So this was another perspective. So I didn't see them as this thing as. So I think that to say that they went off and also maybe at least looks to me a little bit of exaggeration thing, and maybe it's because just comparing yourself with the North Indian businessman. But even the North Indian businessman, there are a lot of a very small business community has become a very tiny, minuscule set of traders and businessmen have become very big. I mean, Marwad itself is a very small area, very minuscule area. And so is Gujarat. And that is the place where which these people, successful people, came. They come from 1 or 2 villages, or 3, 4 villages, or 10 or 15 villages, and or groups of villages, in Marwad, in Junjunwala, Junjunu area, another area kind of thing. So, and also these caste networks, though, again, I don't fully agree that there's a breakdown of the old thing. I think there, here again, cattle trade is an issue. See, if it is totally broken down, they couldn't be these few people from these dominant. Of course, the old structures broke down. That's not, I mean, the radical change was there. But they had to continue. That the only way we can explain why only these communities and people from them are still, I mean, there are a few exceptions, of course, but these communities are still the major businessmen in India, not only in Chettiars, but also in North India, and with a few exceptions. And of course, the biggest exception, actually, if the whole of post-independence India is really the IT software and services exports and IT-enabled services. That's the biggest exception, which does not link itself to any of these, the old caste networks and this thing. And there are reasons for that need not address here. So I thought that, and now you see, I was reading about them. Of course, he has given the evidence that Murugappa group, I didn't know much about them earlier, but how they are so diversified. And recently, I've even found that now they've started a semiconductor design company in Bangalore, and then they've started a hardware manufacturing project they're going to start in Gujarat, of all the places. It's like you're getting to the lion's den almost. You're going to Gujarat. Chettiars moving to Gujarat is is the ultimate thing. So you're not really being a South Indian in that sense of the word, or moving away. But of course, you can. What Raman says is that these are exceptions. It's not the general thing. But there are a lot of the plantation owners in Karnataka, in Coorg, for example. Many of the plantations are owned by the Chettiars. Even in Chennai, I used to know people, again Komitis, again Shettis, who were quite good, but they were not in any way, they were businessmen, they had manufacturing, they had a pencil manufacturing, Madras Pencil Factory, which had a they had the alliance with an English pencil manufacturer. And though these committees were in manufacturing, they didn't, and they were prominent, but they didn't rise to the level of the Chettiars. That's the important thing, even in Madras. These are some of the things I had, but and also I had some problem with this issue of industry diversification. They did go into industry. They did go. I mean, as you said, insurance and why the insurance is thing. I mean, I was also a bit surprised that you think that Marxists did emphasize industry in a way, but after all, Lenin wrote imperialism, and he wrote that the age of the 20th century, or the dawn of the 20th century, was the age of finance capital. That you had Hobson's book, and yet industrial capital had, and the 20th century was the dominance of finance capital, and therefore of imperialism. That was what the basis of this thing is there. So I don't see industry as that important. Of course, in India, the banks were nationalized, etc. But if you take global finance, it is as important. I mean, of course, in the 18th century, you had the Industrial Revolution, and unto the middle of the 19th century, where you had railways, etc. But beyond that, you move on to from the industrial barons, even in like United States, to J.P. Morgan and people like that. You got this thing. So it is not necessarily that whether industry is the most important or they didn't go, it's not fully there. And in any case, it's only a small number of businessmen who are really that big in any case. I mean, let's take the Birlas or the Parsis or the Gujaratis. Then, of course, Dhirubhai is an outsider. He came in, and now you have Adani. So it's only small. I mean, the rest of the businessmen are doing the normal kind of business. You have a whole hierarchy of business. And in that hierarchy of business, it seems that the Chettiars do count for something in Tamil Nadu or in other parts of South India, certainly in Karnataka also. These are some of the points I had, and some of the just comments and some ideas that occurred to me, and also they're relevant here. The last point I want to make, which I did make earlier, is that the community structures, certainly what Raman has described in the 20s and 1880s, 80s to 20s, those have totally changed. But have they totally changed, that there is no link between them? I don't think so. But my own experience is that there are links, but these changes have been transformed in newer ways of relationships. And that is the only way we can explain why it is these castes which are continuing to be preeminent or in the Indian system, and why the other castes do not come up, and also, it's like, I think the Rudolphs have written on the modernity of tradition. So it is not that caste has gone away. Caste has become, from status and pollution and purity and all this kind of thing, it's become competitive groups. In the political arena, you're competing for resources and you're mobilizing on the basis of caste, of groups. It transforms. It maybe even becomes stronger. And many of these change also. You have new groups and new coalitions. And but the thing is, so I think we still have the old things, and that today's India, you still have that kind of thing, which of course is not there in only one sector. And even in the sector of the new startups, I find the same caste groups are there. And if you look at a place like United States, and you just look at the caste names that you can make out, you'll find that the caste occupations do not match. You'll find that to some extent they do, but to a large extent they don't. So again, you can see the difference between the relationship between caste and modern industry, and in relation to the Chettiars. Thank you.
One, I'll start with Carol. I couldn't agree with you more on this issue of investment, the distinction you make between industry and non-industry finance, tertiary sector. Carol raised this issue about her discomfort with this dichotomy between industry and and non-industry. I mean, the question of why should it be linear in one way? I mean, why should capital move from banking and finance and trade into industry? The only reason I addressed this issue was because there is a strong body of opinion, in the economic history of the 80s and 90s, where it was argued that post 1930 there was a flight of capital from Burma back into South India, and since the industrialization process in South India, and especially the nodal Tamil region, really kicked off only from the 1930s. I mean, that's when you have the emergence of the major textile industries. And it was argued by none other than even somebody like Omiya Bakchi that the major thrust for this industrialization was provided by the Nattukottai Chettiars. When I looked into it, I found that that was not the case. In fact, not that Chettiars didn't move into industry; they were a handful. But in relation to the size of the community and the total investable capital that they had, the proportion of capital that went into industry was very minuscule. I mean, it is in that context that I said no. Then I was curious to know why are they not moving into industry, especially because there was tariff protection and it was reasonably profitable. I mean, if it was profitable for the Parsis, for the Marwadis, and for the Gujaratis to move into textiles, into sugar, into paper, and a whole range of consumer goods industries in the late 20s and 30s, and the entire jute industry was taken over by the Marwadis, obviously, when it was not that profitable. So I was very curious to address that issue. Why are the Chettiars so different? Why are the Multanis so different? And these are the two communities who stand out, who don't really invest in it. And I'm inclined to believe that the rates of returns were much higher in finance, you see, as compared to investment in industry. I mean, the rates of returns in the 30s were about 6 to 7% in industry. And not just that, I don't know whether the Chettiars were equipped to really invest in industry because it required being conversant with modern technology, being able to adapt modern British imported technology to Indian condition, training Indian labor, handling labor. I mean, all these were issues which perhaps the Chettiars found it, something which they didn't really wish to enter into. So that could be one of the reasons why they chose to reinvest in industry. As for Hari's point about why only Chettiars, what about the other business communities in Tamil Nadu? Which are the other business communities? I mean, at this point of time, I mean, I've looked at carefully. I mean, yes, you're right. There are Berry Chettis, there are Komati Chettis, but they're much smaller. Their sphere of accumulation. Sorry. Nadars, yes, Nadars, Bharatars, but in fact, the entire industrialization process in Coimbatore, the thrust came from agro-commercial capital. It was the Kammas, like in Andhras, which Carol has talked about. Likewise, in Coimbatore, it was the Kammas who really took the initiative in promoting industries in Coimbatore. And much later, the Brahmins come into the picture, as far as the automobile industry is concerned. And you talked about princely states, you see, again, here you find a lot of business communities moving into princely. You take Mysore itself, all these enterprises which were set up in the 30s and 40s. A lot of Chettiar capital does find its way. In fact, if you look at the shareholding capital, the pattern of shareholding in some of these companies, there were a lot of these Chettiars who were associated, but there were also others, non-Chettiars. There were people coming from Western India, Kirloskar, for instance, was investing in Mysore in a major way. So these are some of the. I mean, we can continue our conversation, but I think I'd rather allow people from the audience to raise any questions that they have, so that we continue this discussion. Thank you.
It will be a very broad question. Resources are from the nature. Intellectuals like Nobel laureates, they discover and invent things. And this is a combination which goes to make a product or service 99%. We have electricity, we have everything because 10 people discovered electron and properties of electron. It is science, engineering, technology that combines with nature, that is derived from the dynamics of the nature. And this is the combination which is 99%, which goes into anything that defines civilization. How is that people calling themselves as businessmen take over this 99% and they just manage? And how is it sustainable? First of all, the fact that man is ascertaining arbitrary values for resources of nature, and the intellect of the super intellectuals. Without this, there is nothing. There is not even existence. There is no civilization. How is this? How do you explain this? I have been asking this to World Economic Forum. They came for nanotechnology. They came for space technology and all. They said they agreed with me. The human civilization cannot use the two words simultaneously. They are both mutually exclusive. If you want sustainability, the word economy should be non-existent, because man has no right to ascertain values for resources of nature and call it economy.
Is it possible that the Chettiars spent a lot of their wealth in building all these huge houses, which I saw 2 weeks ago, and which, instead of in productive assets, because when you really look at it, enormous amount of wealth has been put there, which is now, of course, running down. Is it possible why you say that's the end of the Chettiar lineage, because of the wastage of that wealth?
To address your question, I think it's, your question defies capitalism, I mean, it's the logic of capitalism, I mean, you're saying that we should wish away business, and that, so that's not possible. I mean, if you have to come to terms with the whole pattern of development over the last 200-300 years. So it has evolved this, and so yes, these are very relevant issues which are being addressed of sustainable development. But you have to marry sustainable development within the system that prevails right now. I mean, what you're arguing is for a different kind of system, and that calls for different sort of social processes. Yeah, to answer your question, yes, in fact, this was debated by the Chettiars themselves in their journals. In fact, a journal called Vaishyamitran, Kumaran, Urian raised these issues. In fact, it was serialized. I've seen some of those pieces. What is it? Something to the which talks about wasteful expenditure in Tamil. Veena Shalavum, something like that, where all this is included, the whole traditional Chettiar marriages, donations to temples, and so there was this growing feeling that that this productive capital needs to be invested. The capital needs to be invested productively in South India. But the fact is that there were very few opportunities for investment, at this point of time. Talking about the pre-1930 period when all this happened. Many of these buildings came up, in the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, these palatial mansions that you refer to, which are now heritage homes. Some of them have been turned into boutique hotels and heritage homes. Because there were very few investment opportunities. You don't see the other communities doing that as much as you do. It has something to do with, the economic opportunities for investment in South India at that particular point of time. It's really only after 1930s that there are more opportunities emerging for investment. I suppose that could be one reason why they chose to invest money in these huge palatial buildings and donating huge sums to the temples for temple reconstruction. A lot of Chettiar money has gone into including Madura Meenakshi temple. Major contributions from the Chettiars.
I have a bit of thing about fact. So, Mr. Harikumar, if I can correct you, the TI group, as it once was called, or the Murgappa group, hasn't gone into the den of the devil now. They set up a tube factory in Baroda in the early 1970s. Bundy Tubing, an associate company of TI, actually has been in Baroda since the 1970s. But instead of a rambling sort of way, Professor Mahadevan, I really did wonder about, the cultural specificity of what you said in your response to the two speakers, that the Chettiars didn't go into manufacturing because they thought they lacked the ability, skills, etc. They were as well educated, from what I know, as the Marwadis, who had 2 or 3 generations in Kolkata. They were most certainly much more well-versed in the English language and better educated than the Gujarati Vanya. Yeah. So if one thing, I'm leaving the Parsis out. Yeah. So there has to be something much deeper in terms of the macroeconomy of the region they belonged to, or the nature of how they did business, that there were incentives for them to remain in finance and disincentives for them not to, unlike the Marwadis, etc., to move into manufacturing. I think that's something which I would certainly feel that we need to hear more of, because the question does fascinate. Why did somebody other than just the Murgappas, or to a small extent the Spik group, why do we not see other big Chettiar names in the manufacturing industry? I would also at the same time like to caution in the reference to Marx and Lenin on, the hierarchy between capital. I don't want to really go into that, because then we would need to open up the questions apart from what have been said on productive and unproductive capital. There is, outside of Marx, in fact, there is a social hierarchy of capital, social hierarchy of the capitalist world itself, which in the early 20th century set up manufacturing on a pedestal. And by the end of the Second World War, the manufacturing companies of the world were the best known companies, the biggest known companies, the most respected companies. Perhaps banking companies were not so respected because of what they did to lead up to the Great Depression. Today that has changed, if you think about it. That the top 10, if you measure by market capitalization in the globe, are primarily two software companies, a e-retailer. God forbid, a retailer is actually on top of the heap and considered respectable. So there's, this is a changing dynamic of where capital sees profit that begins to look good or bad. I don't think we should really get into the Marxist question, but I would really be keen on trying to understand what motivated the Chettiars to remain within finance and not go further. Also, was there why did they never achieve the scale? It's not as if, the big Marwadis or the Parsis or everyone else. The Birlas had a bank, the Tatas had a bank, they were hit by nationalization because they had grown big. So it's not as if they were not in finance. The Chetties never got to that point. The Chettiars never got to that point, except, of course, the two southern banks. Uh, 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 so they didn't take a hit by the 1969 nationalization. What that means is they were allowed to go in because they were really in, glorified non-banking finance.
Sorry, I meant that they have started a new venture. It is not started. It is it's a semiconductor manufacturing they're going into. And second is there is a semiconductor, what they call a fabless unit with for semiconductor design in Bangalore. So they're going in the most advanced areas of semiconductor, which of course they say that they're doing it because it aligns with the policies of the government of India, that is to develop semiconductor in both the software for it and the hardware for it. Yeah, that's just a clarification.
Yeah, I would suggest you, I don't know whether you've read my book, Okay. Yeah, so, my book does provide some answers to the questions that you've raised as to why it's not just the Murugappa group, there are others also I talk about, but in relation to other business communities, you find that there are not too many moving into industry. And the reasons are very simple. I mean, unlike the Marwadis and the Gujaratis who remained within India, whose accumulation process occurred within the boundaries of India, in the case of the Chettiars, they went out. And then I talk about how the Depression and the Second World War really affected them majorly, in the sense that one, the capital gets locked into, immovable assets in the form of land. In the form of land and in the form of plantations in Malaya, tin mines. They acquire tin mines. They acquire plantations in Malaya, land in Burma. I mean, they were the largest landowners, And one particular firm owned 1 lakh acres of the best land in the Irrawaddy Delta. So you can imagine. So obviously, and then when they wanted to repatriate some of the capital post 40, there were income tax, restrictions. This is very evident from the representations made by Chettiar saying that you should allow us. If you're encouraging foreign capital, you're encouraging European capital to come and invest in Indian industry. Why don't you give us tax remissions so that we can bring our capital from Malaya and elsewhere to? So it's not as though they didn't want to invest. In fact, you would be surprised that in the 40s, early 40s, investment in man-made fibers was a big thing, there were only 2 firms which invested in India in this sphere, in this sector. One was Birla's. He set up Gwalior rayons in Gwalior. And interestingly, both of them, these investments occurred in princely state. And the other was Travancore rayons in a place called Perumbavoor in Kerala by the MCT Chettiar group. So it's not as though they were reluctant to invest in industry. Some of the groups, not all of them. And let's not forget that, and that's the point that I'm making in this, that we have to factor in the process of social differentiation within the communities. There was the lower class, there was a middle class, and there was an upper crust within an elite class within the Chettiars, So the entrepreneurial response of them varied significantly between these classes, you see. So that has to be factored in.
Good evening. I kind of must apologize in advance because this question kind of like only indirectly relates to the topic of the evening. The question is actually for Professor Upadhya, who spoke about a certain discourse, a bit about like a certain tension between like the kinds of people, the kinds of groups which contribute to the economy via mercantile activities and those which contribute via industrial activities. And it occurred to me that like a certain disdain for like financiers, merchants, and people of that sort is kind of like a cross-cultural thing. Like in from Western culture, you have Jesus and the money changers, and you have Shylock and his pound of flesh. Like if you go to like China and Japan, you have this Confucian belief in the low status of the merchant class relative to even like farmers and such. And like even in the modern world, and especially since like the Great Recession, we have had this kind of like suspicion and distrust of the finance sector as a whole. And I was wondering if like this discourse that you spoke of, is it like a broader cross-cultural context in which it is situated? And are there like certain things which make this particular case of India unique? For example, I don't know, maybe the caste system plays into it.
Do you have thoughts on that? I don't think I can answer that directly. It also struck me when I was reading the book that there is a kind of, around the world there seems to be this kind of bias, and Jews in Europe and similar groups. And I think Weber actually writes about this at some point, that why is it that mercantile groups seem to gain a reputation, a negative reputation, because of their handling control over money or debt, etc. But I don't know whether in India you can say, my question, I think that what came to my mind was whether this kind of, there was so much discussion about money lending in the various commissions during this period in British India, and about the problem of money lending as, undermining the peasantry, et cetera, and agriculture. And I'm wondering to what extent that was something which was coming from the grassroots, or it's like a kind of European prejudice that was being superimposed. As you know, in the Varna system, Brahmins are first, next Kshatriya, and third Vaishya. So Vaishya are not on the top, but they're not on the bottom either. So I don't know whether this is a kind of indigenous prejudice or it's something which kind of gets constructed during colonialism. I don't have an answer, but maybe you do.
No. All I will say is that, you can't take a static sort of thing, a position on this, because at some point of time, merchants do become industrialists. It's not that they remain merchants, and insofar as India is concerned, you do have the Deccan Riots of Bombay, for instance, Maharashtra, when the money lending castes do receive a bad press. There were other instances elsewhere also, but you don't have the equivalent of a Shylockian, thing in India. The Chettiars, for instance, were characterized as blood-sucking in many of the peasant revolts in the 1930s. The Sansean revolt in Burma in the early 30s was directed against the Burmese, against the Chettiars, precisely because of the kind of system that had evolved, where the extraction of imposition of very high rates of interest and the dispossession of the land, of the Burmese land as a result of depression, did cause this kind of a situation.
Can I just follow up then 1 second? So I found that point in the book very interesting, that, I didn't know that they had, acquired so much land in Burma and then they basically become landlords, leasing out land to tenants on top of the money lending role, and that's why you get this revolt. But in India, they don't do this, right? I think the money lending groups in India, by and large, never were not into acquiring land as a way of getting their money back. Am I wrong? And therefore, the similar type of rebellion may not have occurred in most places.
Perhaps not on that scale. They do acquire land in India as well. Some of the largest landowners were Chettiars in the Tamil region. No, not only plantation, even agricultural land, especially in the 19th century. The entire Ramnad Principality, the Ramnad Zamindari, was pledged to some of the leading Chettiar firms. So they acquired control over it because of the inability of the Ramnath family to repay the loans. Yeah, so that happens, but not on the scale on which it happened in Burma. So, in fact, in Burma, they were categorized as fairy dragons, the Chettiars, because of the manner in which they were able to, they exploited the local peasantry and acquired control over their land through money lending, basically.
Good evening. I have to admit at the outset that we are studying and deliberating on a decline of a community, which isn't usually the case in India. It's usually shoved under the rug. So I appreciate your efforts. And I must admit the diversity of this crowd. There's like a Gujarati, Sindhi, and Marwadi in the front row. So you've got the audience right for your book. I have just two questions, one on risk and the second on tools. What was the average risk appetite of a Chettiar, probably the main decision maker in a family? What was that like? And the second is, what were the tools they were using to facilitate the banking system? Like a Marwadi had Parta and we had the Hundi system and we had runners and all of that to facilitate this entire national level of trade between Marwadis. What were some unique practices by the Chettiars that you can shed light on?
No, it's an amazing story. I mean, I think you'll have to transport yourself to the mid-19th century and just imagine traveling in sailing boats, going all the way to, the first firm was set up in 1850, and thereafter there is a gradual, increase in the number of firms. One follows the other. The major growth happens after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, when the distance between Europe and Asia is reduced significantly. And therefore, it aids the process of commercialization. Goods can be transported much quickly and at cheaper rates. And there was an enormous clamor for primary products from Southeast Asia, whether it's rubber for the growing tire industry, tins for the manufacture of cars, and rice to feed the Europeans, and glue. In fact, the Burmese rice was used for the starch industry. The starch industry, the primary raw material for it was the Burmese rice. So so what I'm saying is just transport yourself to mid-19th century. That's the risk element, going all the way and not knowing the language, learning the language, the Burmese language, going into the interior parts of swampy Irrawaddy Delta, setting up little shops and lending money to the Burmese peasants, who can in turn clear the land and cultivate rice. So this entire process was, none of the Burmese had the resources to provide credit. So that's where the Chettiars come in. So enormous risk. Likewise in Malaysia. And of course, in Malaya, they had to face competition of the Chinese. There were the Chinese, overseas Chinese, who were also operating. So there was competition there, unlike in Burma, where they had a monopoly over the credit market. So that's the kind of element of risk that they had to take. And yes, they had the same Hundi system as in Gujarat and amongst the Marwadis. So because rice had to be transported from the interior to the major towns, whether it's Akyab or Rangoon, and then thereafter it had to be processed. And the major processing mills were all Europeans. So Bullock Brothers and a number of others, who controlled these huge rice mills, and it was processed, packed, and transported to Europe. So it's a Chettiar finance which paved the way for this entire production of rice on the scale on which it was done in the course of the 19th century and the 20th century.
Yes, I have not read the book, Perhaps the answer to my question is in the book. But the question is, you mentioned after the 1930s, and I'm referring mainly to the role of Chettiars in Burma, they started a process of adaptation. Very clearly, what happened subsequently implied that those adaptations were not enough. And the community was seen in a negative light by the nationalist movement in Burma, and of course, finally led to their expulsion. In the conversations that you had with some of the Chettiars that you mentioned about, did you get the feeling that there was a thought that they could perhaps have handled it differently? Because after all, the community did contribute significantly to the growth in rice production, traded rice, etc. But the way of their exit was not in that positive light. So did you get the feeling that they could have handled it differently?
You see, many of these developments were beyond the control of the Chettiars. It is the depression which, because the Chettiars were not very keen in taking over the land, but you see, the depression had the effect of sharply reducing the price of paddy. It fell very sharply between 1929 and 31. And as a result of which the Burmese peasants who had taken credit from the Chettiars were unable to repay the loan, following which the Chettiars foreclosed and took possession of the land which was pledged as collateral with the money lending firms. So that's how they come into possession of this land. Once they came into possession of this land, the depression lasted till about 3 or 4 years, between 1930 and 33, 34, when the prices remained relatively depressed. Post 34, the prices start growing up. So the big adjustment or accommodation that they had to make, was to now oversee the production of rice. They were not, they were essentially money lenders. So the big change that happens is now they become, they're no longer money lenders, but they are landowners now. So they had to employ tenants, cultivate the land, produce rice, transport it to the rice mills, and market it. So this is the new role that the Chettiars assumed post 1930. So that is it. As regards, yes, certainly there was, a divided opinion. Many of the Chettiars whom I talked to felt that they ought to have, sort of resolved this issue and somehow left. But, the problem was that the prices remained very depressed right until 1939. The land values remained very depressed in Burma. So there was no incentive for them to sell the land. There were no buyers. Who would buy the land? So unless you had a buyer, you were able to recoup whatever you had invested, then it's possible that the Chettiars may have considered coming back to India, but that option was not available for them.
I'd like to thank Professor Raman Mahadevan, Professor Carol Upadhya, and K.N. Hari Kumar for bringing today's session to BIC. Thank you to the audience for spending your evening with us.